Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt with the fifth entry in a series entitled Life is Layered. I'm going to call today's talk Spiritual Substratum. Substratum in the sense of geological layering. Quite a few thinkers over the years have looked at human existence and its complexity and described it in terms of depth. And some of these thinkers have written wonderful novels and essays, which I regularly teach. Take Oscar Wilde from the late 19th century. He wrote a novel called The Picture of Dorian Gray. And at the beginning of the novel, he provides a preface filled with some of Wilde's favorite epigrammatic statements, including this passage: "All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their own peril." Wilde appears to be wittily recognizing that all beautiful things have a surface which we can fixate on, and they also can signify something deeper if we allow them to. The story that he tells is about a young, beautiful man who decides to live a life of pleasure and see how far it can take him. In a sense, the novel takes the measure of hedonism because Dorian seeks out sensuous pleasures of all kinds without thinking about the ramifications to other people or the ramifications to his psychology or his spiritual nature. Each of these different layers of life are addressed in turn by Oscar Wilde. And the conclusion is rather surprising. I'll leave it to you to discover that. In Joseph Conrad's novel Lord Jim from the early 20th century, we have once again his favorite narrator telling us a story. This is Charlie Marlowe, in which he describes, in this particular narrative, a young man who has committed a crime against his own sense of self. He has proven himself a coward, and he can't really face this failure. So he's running, always running. And Charlie Marlowe tells us that very few of us have the will or the capacity to look consciously under the surface of familiar emotions. Many of us would rather distract ourselves and run from the things that unsettle us. In James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, a college dean speaks to his hero. His hero's name is Stephen Dedalus, another young man who's going through school. And this dean asks this intelligent young student for some observations about aesthetics, about beauty. And Stephen replies, I get a good idea maybe once every fortnight, every 2 weeks, if I'm lucky. And the dean responds, quote, "These questions about beauty and so on are very profound. Only the trained diver can go down into the depths and explore them and come to the surface again." There's the implication that going down involves risk, and you might get trapped. Things lie waiting to be discovered, but sometimes the treasure can have a magnetic pull and drown you. Stephen himself drowns a few times in this novel, metaphorically speaking. He is trying to figure out what facets of beauty he is going to preoccupy himself with as a young artist. Is it the cadence and the lyricism of rhymed verse? Is it the beautiful bodies of the girls and women who move through the world that he inhabits? What particular aspects of beauty is he going to be satisfied with? In the late 1920s, Virginia Woolf writes A Room of One's Own. It's a fictionalized account of herself and some other thinkers who are looking for a powerful woman writer. And she herself is one. But her narrator describes the search in this way. She's looking for an author who might prove, quote, "by summoning, beckoning, and getting together, that she was not a skimmer of surfaces merely, but had looked beneath into the depths." For Virginia Woolf, the depths involve the material world, the sociological world, and very much the psychological world. She spends a whole lot of time inside the minds of her characters and is famous for doing this using stream of consciousness techniques. However, for Virginia Woolf, there is no spiritual world. There might be characters who believe in God and the soul, but she does not validate the existence of such things in her novels. Flannery O'Connor, writing a couple decades later, flips things around. She is a Christian, a Catholic, and she writes in one of her essays, Novelist and Believer, the artist penetrates the concrete world in order to find at its depth the image of its source, the image of ultimate reality. For O'Connor, you look very closely at the material world, at the physical world, and discover, when you do so, something behind it, beneath it, that motivates it, that activates it, that makes it matter. Matter matters because of a creator God behind things. She often refers to the divine, the supernatural, as mystery in her writing. Now, there have also been a few notable figures throughout history who have created different models of human experience that involve layers. I'll just mention a couple. Sigmund Freud's model of the unconscious suggests that only a small portion of what our mind is up to actually rises to the surface, to our awareness, that most of our mind's machinations lie hidden, unseen in our unconscious. Abraham Maslow and his model of the hierarchy of needs, this pyramid, right? He argues things a little bit differently, and he moves in a different direction. He takes the verticality of Freud and others and reverses it and suggests that the things that matter most, we can't help but deal with, right? So they are at the bottom. They are foundational to our existence, to our very survival. So food and liquid nourishment and our roof over our heads, these kinds of things are necessary if we're going to live day to day. And only after we've taken care of the lower levels can we consider the higher levels of existence, which lead to actual self-actualization and human flourishing. Now, I have been slowly building a different model over the last few entries. It's related to these others, but involves some, I think, key differences. My model suggests that we dig deep down towards truth, into successive layers of reality, of substratum, beneath the tangible or sensuous world. Today, we're going to arrive at a layer which some consider to be bedrock, a foundation on which everything else rests, and which some deny even exists, the spiritual. Those who deny the existence of spiritual, supernatural things, and this is going to encompass the idea of deity, of God, of a creator loving God, and the soul and eternity. Oftentimes those who reject these things attribute belief in such spurious ideas to desperation and delusion, problems they might trace to some of these other layers of reality. So some might say that is when you are very desperate, when you are starving, when existence is difficult on a regular basis, that you want to believe that things could be better in some ultimate eternal arbiter who's going to create the justice that seems to be eluding you in this world. Other cynics might point to the social dimension and suggest that believers want to be surrounded by a matrix of friends, that they're actually quite lonely and desperate for connection, and for a connection not just to people, but to a God who would never abandon them because he is supposedly omniscient and omnipresent, knowing everything about you and always there. Other unbelievers who would like to push out the idea of the spiritual and the supernatural and say that this is delusion might point to trauma, the trauma of our own mortality or the trauma of a particular event, and say that when we are feeling weakest and most vulnerable, we desperately concoct something to hold on to or rest upon. And this is, this is a product of lots of different struggles that we may be having. Maybe there's anxiety and depression, which is a result of past trauma. And so we look for something that could take all the chaotic elements of our lives and somehow impose order on them, impose order on our minds and our hearts both. Now, Those who firmly believe in the supernatural would suggest that their belief solves all of these problems, not that it creates them. In my last talk, I suggested that human motivation is very, very messy, that no particular action can be traced back to one motivating factor. So far, I've considered the material world and those kinds of motivations, that universal desire to multiply pleasure and to sidestep pain whenever we can. I also considered the sociological dimension of reality and included our tendency to define ourselves in opposition to other people, at least as often as we seek out affiliations with those who are similar to ourselves. We also considered psychological processes, classical and operant conditioning, dream states, the fears and desires that often are a very key part of who we are, but which we don't like to think about, so they're hidden beneath our consciousness, as Freud and others would suggest. Today I'm going to add another layer, the spiritual, the possibility of a fourth motivational factor, which is going to look rather illogical, even absurd and ridiculous to some people, because operating according to this dimension involves disregarding the sociological sometimes, and ignoring what other people think and how a particular action might affect your relations with others. And is also going to look absurd because it might involve compromising or risking your own well-being, your psychological well-being, your physical health. Not because you've had a psychotic break, but because of faith in the power of a love far greater than that which you yourself are usually able to manage. Does that sound sentimental or maybe a little wishy-washy? Let's consider a few things. So Paul of Tarsus, when he's defining love in 1 Corinthians 13, this is a letter to the church at Corinth, written 2,000 years ago, he maintains that everything in life, even all those things that we would like to pat ourselves on the back for, the most heroic things that we might achieve, are meaningless if they're not motivated by love. Even if we give away all we possess, or die a martyr for the sake of some supposedly noble cause, our actions are empty if love does not undergird our actions, our time, and our energy. Motivation matters. But what kind of love is Paul actually talking about? Surely it's not the sort of love that we have for food or even a beloved pet. Is it maybe the type of love we feel for family members with whom we've experienced many years of good and bad times? Or might it be that affection that binds together friends with whom we share a common interest, like a preoccupation with hiking or kayaking or quilting or films by Hayao Miyazaki? Or could it be a love which is more akin to that romantic passion, that powerful feeling that we have for someone with whom we are romantically involved? Could it share features of all of these? Is it something else? The Greek word that Paul actually uses is agape or agape, and he could have used many other words. Many of these words these Greek words we have all collapsed into love and expect that one English word to do the work of all these different ideas. This is a kind of sacrificial love that expects nothing in return. That's rather absurd. A selfless, a truly selfless love, which raises the question, is this only a God thing, or can humans actually somehow practice agape? Is it possible to ever do this, even for a moment? Let's look at this through the lens of some college conversations I had with friends. One friend in particular, conversations that went long into the night a few times, a wonderful friend. We had very different ideas about things. So before we get to that conversation, let's look at some classroom conversations. As a psychology major, I took many psychology courses which continually introduced me to the figure of B.F. Skinner, a behaviorist very important in the 20th century, who believed in what he called radical behaviorism. The idea was that all of our actions are determined by environmental conditions and conditioning, classical and operant conditioning, that there is no such thing as free will. You think about the most supposedly selfless thing that you might ever do, the most heroic thing, and he would say it was predetermined by a number of factors that could be traced if you were willing to do that. In biology, I came across the notion that everything can be reduced to self-preservation. This is very similar to what we saw with the hierarchy of needs, Maslow. That ultimately the desire to perpetuate your own bloodline and to keep yourself alive, these things trump all other factors. Even when it looks like we're being sympathetic to other people, we only do so because there is survival value in actually caring for other people and creating certain kinds of rules that might regulate our behavior. It's all part of, and here I'm using philosophical language, a kind of, or sociological, it appears in both disciplines, a kind of social contract in which people implicitly buy into or sign off on. This notion that we give over certain things in exchange for security. And we do this implicitly, perhaps without even thinking about it. And then the philosophy conversations that I had took place outside of the classroom with this dear friend of mine. She never mentioned Immanuel Kant or Friedrich Nietzsche or Ayn Rand, though her thinking may have been shaped by some of these folk. But she did mention Richard Bach explicitly a few times, and actually encouraged me to read Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I don't know if you guys know that text. Bach wrote elsewhere this. He says, "Your conscience is the measure of the honesty of your selfishness. Listen to it carefully." This is predicated on the assumption that we are all innately selfish and that there's really no way around that selfishness. And this friend of mine would pose different theoretical scenarios. We would work through these and suggest that even if, say, you see someone in danger and in a split second you make a decision to risk your own life to save theirs, right? So like somebody's about to get mowed over by a bus and you rush in front of the bus to push them out of the way and are hit yourself. That there is something in your mind that is convinced that you're going to be rewarded for this. That there's, even if it's for a split second, that benefit of I've been the hero, my life actually matters, would be enough of a reason to do it. That's a reward. Or a belief in an afterlife where you would be affirmed for having given your life for someone else. That you can always come up with an explanation, a selfless explanation for doing a supposedly good thing. And therefore, altruism is an illusion. It's not possible to really be selfless. So sit on that for a second. Do you think that it's possible that everything that we do is selfish, that is always selfish, and that there's no way to truly be selfless? Let's consider what Jesus said, and this may surprise you. He models a sacrificial agape love himself, obviously. But his teaching on selflessness has an interesting postscript. So if you look at, this is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, he says about giving to the needy, to those who are orphans and widows and who are dependent for survival on the kindness of others. He says, "So whenever you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. They are receiving public acclaim from their social networks, so that is the way in which they're being reinforced for doing good things. They draw attention to their goodness. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your alms may be done in secret, so that your acts of kindness and the money that you're giving to others may remain a secret. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. To me, this suggests that we very quickly forget about what we've done. Do it, and then don't rehearse it to yourself. Definitely don't narrate it to others. Just move on, right? Now, immediately after this, in the gospel account of Matthew, he says, and your Father, that's God, who sees in secret will reward you. Okay, so does that then mean that we need some kind of promised reward in order to actually do a good thing? Just think about it in the afterlife, that there's some kind of compensation, some kind of promise that we should hold to. Is Jesus convinced that we can't really truly be selfish? Or is he suggesting that we should consciously create layers of awareness in our minds, perhaps apprehend the possibility of God's being thankful and being proud of our doing the right thing, but that we shouldn't constantly think about that when we're doing good, that we should allow goodness itself to draw us towards radical acts of altruism and kindness. So that what we're actually being motivated by is a desire to do the right thing, not the sense of being compensated after death for it. Or is what C.S. Lewis suggests in The Problem of Pain possible? He says, there are rewards that don't sully motives. In other words, just because something brings you conscious pleasure doesn't mean you're selfish to want it. And he talks about the love of another person that we're pursuing romantically, or the joy that we might take in jumping up and down when we're pursuing exercise for health reasons. Let's consider 3 different theoretical scenarios. And they're not that theoretical because I think many of us face or will face these kinds of things in our lives. And consider whether there's room for a spiritual dimension in each of these. I'll try to separate out the motivational layers for the sake of discussion, but let's remember that all of these layers necessarily interpenetrate one another. So, first example, doing laundry. So, from a material perspective, let's say I really like the smell of freshly laundered clothing. You know, it's because of the softeners that are used in the washing machine, or those dry layer sheet things that are placed into the dryer. There's a floral scent, which I really appreciate. And I just have an instinctive appreciation of those scents, that aroma that I inhale when I'm wearing these clothing. And, you know, if you've been outside working for a long time and you get mud caked on your pants and they become very stiff, that's not very comfortable. So washing all that stuff out makes them soft, and there's that tactile sensation, which is also pleasant. So that's the material level. The sociological level might involve our workplace. So our coworkers prefer when we dress nicely in clean clothing that smells good and looks sharp, because we present ourselves as a team to clients as professional, as respecting them by dressing up, and that can help with the bottom line, with selling a product or our services. And it potentially benefits everyone involved. And there's also love interest. If you're looking for a life partner, it makes sense to take a shower, right? And to clean your clothing, because if we're going to be around someone else for a long period of time, usually we like to associate their presence with nice smells and nice things to look at aesthetically. Of course, our sense of aesthetics, or of beauty and what is attractive, is shaped by other people. That's sociological, and also might have something to do with the psychological. Perhaps in addition to operant conditioning, which has reinforced us because we were mocked for wearing one thing or praised for wearing another, perhaps we have some deep-seated issues, some really sad memories, which are shaping our behavior today. Maybe we were mocked as a kid for wearing cheap clothing or dirty clothing. It wasn't washed regularly enough. So we have this legacy of shame, which is chasing us towards trying to look much better today. So there's anxiety associated with it. Could we find a spiritual dimension in doing laundry? Let's imagine someone who does laundry for the family and does it pretty regularly. Now, in my own marriage, Tracy and I go through phases where different people, different in the family, are responsible for different things. Let's say that one person is responsible for washing and drying and folding and putting away the clothing. Is it possible for something supernatural to be involved? Let's say that a person does this and manages for a period of time, maybe it's short-lived, maybe they are able to sustain this for 30 minutes, but is able to do it with joy. Even though it involves sacrifice, they'd rather be doing something else. But instead of being bitter and tallying up what other people owe them because they're doing this for them and not really receiving thanks for it on a regular basis, definitely not as regularly as they're actually doing the laundry, is it possible that that illogical joy is attributable not necessarily just to psychological, sociological, material things, but to something transcendent, which we have tapped into? Let's consider a second example. So this has to do with tending to some trees that are on the edge of your property, between you and your front yard, say, and the street. Let's say that they're gala apples, so a kind of apple that's been around in the United States for a while. And there are obvious physical benefits of these apples. There's the beautiful, wonderful scent that wafts to you on the wind and that you take into your nasal passages, right? You appreciate the olfactory stimuli, and of course the gustatory one, the taste. You just love these apples in the mouth, and there's health benefits to those, right? An apple a day and all that. And as a fringe benefit, the apples, because of their placement, the apple trees provide a sound barrier. They muffle the sound from the street, cars screeching to a halt and backfiring, and actually replace those sounds with the rustling of leaves. The sociological benefit is probably pretty obvious as well. So the tree itself might provide a play area for kids to run around and to climb up. So there's a lot of happiness associated with the tree as kids are growing if you're raising them. And there's also the possibility of taking those apples and just giving them to people, putting boxes out for the neighbors to pick up, or maybe people without a home and without regular income who could benefit from free food, right? So you're providing that as a service to others, helping to remedy in a very small way certain kinds of injustice by providing free apples, and maybe baking pies and apple crisp and creating apple butter and all these things which can be given to others to cement connection, to cement relationships with them. Now, the psychological dimension might come into play when we think about why I like gala apples, and it's not just the taste. I, say, had a grandmother with gala apples on her lawn, and I have lots of positive associations with visiting her, and these gala apples are nostalgic for me, right? So it's nice to have those associations in the present. And just to complicate things further, let's say that I was injured my senior year in high school, the same year that my grandmother died, and that I actually fell out of the tree. I was climbing it, broke both my arms, and was unable to play sports my senior year in high school. So a very traumatic end to that experience with the apple tree. And then my grandmother died, and I didn't have an opportunity to erase the negative emotion association. So that's the last memory that I had, are these very negative feelings. So I'm trying to erase those by having gala apples on my own property and allowing other people to enjoy them. So to kind of compensate for the negative experience. And let's say there's a spiritual possibility in the midst of all of this. Let's assume that one has fallen on really hard times, and we actually need the apples to survive. We're eating them a lot in the fall when they're fresh. And our plan is to actually store them for the winter. Maybe we're taking some of the less beautiful apples that have some problems with them and cutting them up and drying them so that they can be eaten during the leaner months. And we really need this to survive. And yet we're aware of a troop of immigrants who's coming through the area. And these folk really need food. They are in at least as bad a position as we are, but probably worse because they are also itinerant. They don't have a place to rest their head. They're moving from location to location. So giving to them is a good thing to do. Is it possible that we could do that? That we could give to them some of what we need joyfully, trusting that things are going to work out, that there's a larger plan or design which is going to care for us. And we don't need to be anxious about tomorrow, about saving for next week or next month, that doing good now is its own reward, and that there is someone else who's looking over us, who's going to care for us in the long term. Last example. So in the late 4th century, St. Augustine wrote what many consider to be the first autobiography in the Western tradition. And it involves a lot of confessions, right? It's called Confessions. And Augustine is exploring early in the novel his experience of grief. Now he's recalling when he writes this something that happened years earlier, but he really kind of brings that sense of loss to the surface. He describes the tragedy of loss in a few different ways. And I'm going to read from one page, but I'm going to mix up the order here to match the layers as I've introduced them. So first of all, he writes, "Lord, all that belongs to the past, and with time, my wound is less painful." So he recognizes that with the passage of time, those physical sensations that he associated with his friend, the sound of his laughter, the feel of his arm and his own arm, the look of him, that all of these things are fading. And with that fading, he's also losing the pain associated with the loss of his friend. So there's a psychological and a physical dimension that are intermixed there. And then he talks about the social dimension. He writes, now is not the time to be putting questions, but to be making confession to you. I was in misery. And misery is the state of every soul overcome by friendship with mortal things and lacerated when they are lost. He's recognizing this is natural, to feel that vacuum and want to fill it with the person who has died. This is inevitable, to feel that tearing when someone passes. And he also writes of what I would call the psychological. He says, I had no hope that he would come back to life. My tears did not petition for this. I was not asking for that. I merely grieved and wept. I was in misery and had lost the source of my joy. Or is weeping really a bitter thing, which gives relief only when we cannot bear to think of the things which formerly we enjoyed and which is pleasurable at the moments when we shrink from the memory of them? So he's describing how grief and weeping is a double-edged sword, that it can hurt, it can deepen the pain, but it can also bring a release, a measure of pleasure, because it provides us an alternative to recounting all the best moments that we shared with someone. And then he says, yet if our tearful entreaties did not reach your ears, no remnant of hope would remain for us. He's suggesting that deep down there is this instinct that knows that when we cry out in the midst of our suffering, that does not fall on deaf ears. It does not just dissipate, that there is someone who cares, who hears, and is going to respond in one way or another to our sadness, our very deep, profound sense of loss. Now, a broad-minded person might suggest that all of these different features of reality are at play, that simultaneously in grief and in other more quotidian, mundane aspects of life, the material, the sociological, the psychological, and even the spiritual are at work simultaneously. What do you think?